We've been going through the book of Daniel, and those first 6 chapters of Daniel are mostly narrative, meaning they tell the story with a little bit of prophecy. And when we get into chapter 7 through 12, it's mostly prophecy with a little bit of narrative. But we went through the last 3-4 chapters of Daniel that were narrative stories that many of us were familiar with, either from vacation Bible school, Sunday school, or children's messages, right? We went through those through one message where there were multiple opportunities for me to take some side roads, run down some rabbit trails, so to speak. And I mentioned that last week when we were going through Daniel 6, that there were several to go through. We could have gone down a rabbit trail on prayer, but when we get to chapter 9, we're going to be covering prayer pretty heavily. We could go with idolatry through those first few chapters. The issue of bigotry, anti-Semitism is in here. We could have gone down that. Today we're going to look at jealousy and envy somewhat. And we're going to look at the overall theme that these 6 chapters tell is God's sovereignty, God's ability to control everything. So for a quick review, remember that chapter 1, the story there was Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, would not defile themselves with the king's food. And the last line in there, towards the end of it, that the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And in chapter 2 was Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue with various metals. And it, the head of gold, which was Babylon, with the chest and arms of silver, which stands for the Medo-Persian kingdom, the torso of bronze that was for the Greek kingdom, and the legs of iron that signify the Roman. And Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of that chapter, at the end of the revelation of Daniel revealing that to him, he said, the king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery. And chapter 3 was the 3 that were unwilling to bow at the idol created by Nebuchadnezzar. He put this idol up in the middle of the plain near Babylon. Remember, Babylon's a huge province, and he conquered all sorts of civilizations, all sorts of cultures. And so he thought, well, let's unite everybody. We'll make one God that everybody can unite. And he forgot about the God that Israel worshipped, which forbade any other worship. And so that's when the 3 young men decided, we're not going to bow. And they were thrown into the fire. They survived that. Nebuchadnezzar called them out. And at the end of that, he said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. Therefore I decree the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. So you see the progression here. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar says, the Jewish God, he's the God of God, he's the most powerful. And then he sees the demonstration of his power in the fiery furnace. And in chapter 4, he still hasn't submitted to God's rulership or God's sovereignty in his own life. Chapter 4 is the dream about the tree stump and his 7-year insanity. And that ended, Daniel chapter 4, verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, meaning he submitted, he realized that there's someone bigger than him, someone more powerful than him. And then he goes on to say, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he has done is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride he is able to humble. He knew firsthand God was able to humble him. Chapter 5, Belshazzar's boasting and mocking the God. You know, they drank the wine and the goblets taken from God's temple. And while doing so, they were praising the gods of gold, silver, bronze, and wood and stone. And that, of course, ended with the handwriting on the wall and ended with Belshazzar's slaying that evening. And chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den. And that ended with this new king, Darius of the Medes and Persians, issuing a decree to all people. Remember, his kingdom's even bigger than Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. I issue a decree that every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is a living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. So that's those 6 chapters combined into about 5 minutes. So one side road we're going to go down, and it's a fairly easy one. It's easy to recognize in the scripture, maybe not easy to deal with in life, and that has to do with envy or jealousy. We see that in Daniel chapter 3, verse 8. When the 3 friends of Daniel refused to bow to the idol, these astrologers, Chaldeans, came forward to denounce the Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. Now at this time, those 3 young men had been in servanthood to the king for roughly 10 to 15 years. And yet, these astrologers were envious of their position, envious of their talents and abilities. And so they pointed them out. And it struck me this week that if everybody's supposed to be bowing to this image, bowing to the image, how do they see the 3 young men not looking? You know, they really weren't being sincere of their worship. And then chapter 6, verse 4, you know, the satraps, the Chaldeans, they're after Daniel. They're jealous of his position, of his abilities. And they tried to find grounds for charges against him, but they were unable to do so. And so they go to the king and say, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, at this point, he's served for 60 to 70 years, and they're still holding this idea that he's an exile, he's an outsider, and they're holding that against them. What is the cost of their envy? Well, we saw that last week, right? Where those that accused Daniel thrown into the lion's den. Those guys claimed, the lions weren't hungry, or their teeth were bad, or, Daniel was hiding in the straw. Okay, you think that's so? Get in there yourself and see if they eat. Well, they ate them. So there's a message there to us about envy and the dangers of envy. And I suspect I'm not the only one here who struggles with envy. Am I? When I started my business, Metal Casters, in 1999, there were a couple brothers I know, Mike and Brian New, who started New Industries in Three Rivers about the same time, and they had a die casting shop. And boy, within about 6 months, they were doing $30,000, $40,000 of business a month and just going like guns. And it turns out that they were doing subcontracting for another die caster. And I'm going home, Lord, I worked 3 years on this business plan. I know what I'm doing here. Why am I not getting this business? I was envious of their busyness. Well, I learned just a few weeks after that the company they were doing business for didn't like to pay in normal 30-day terms. Mike and Brian had to hire temporary people to help make all this work. And then their customer went 60, 90 days on payment, and they didn't have the funds to finance that work. And it turned out for the last month or so, all the family members were in there working for nothing to get this product out. And then the business had a fire and they ended up closing. So there was a lesson there for me. Okay, Lord, slow growth is better than fast, explosive growth when you don't have a line of credit to access. Now I'm in another position here as a ministry in a church, and I see other pastors that are having this explosive growth. And talking with a pastor over in Niles, a friend of mine, and he says, yeah, it's all about nickels and noses. You try to pack in nickels and noses. Well, it's the people filling it up so that you get the nickels. Is that really what we're doing? Is that really what we're called to do, to have more people in the church? No, we're here to make disciples. And so that's the challenge. I'm working through that struggle, that envy part of me as well. And maybe you've got your own envies that you're dealing with too. Lawnmowers, whatever it might be. Anyway, the whole idea is to turn it over to God, right? To trust in Him and His sovereignty. And that's what the big story is of Daniel. These first 6 chapters of Daniel, actually the whole book of Daniel, has to do with God's sovereignty, His control over everything. And so to put that all in perspective, we need to look at some history. And I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as I can. Just to put it all in perspective. God began His revelation of Himself to Abraham and promised Abraham that he would have children that he couldn't count. To create a great nation, a nation that would proclaim God to all the other nations. The duty of Israel, the creation of Israel, was so that they could be a witness of God, the true God, to all the neighboring kingdoms. To bring an understanding of His righteousness to the rest of the world. However, what's our human nature? God chose Israelites and they thought we're special. And they were prejudicial to other kingdoms. And so God's desire is for His creation to trust in His sovereignty, to trust in His goodness and His protection, and really rely on a relationship with Him. He kept telling the Israelites, you don't need a king, I'm your king. And they kept fighting that, and finally God allowed Samuel to anoint Saul as the first king of Israel. People were happy until this power went to Saul's head, and he got into a situation. He was going to go into battle, and he's waiting for Samuel to come and make a sacrifice and then find God's blessing in this battle. And Samuel's a little bit late, and so Saul takes it on his own and says, I'm going to go ahead and do this in place of Samuel. Improper worship. He didn't follow God's rules on worship and hierarchy, and at that point, God decided it was time for a new king. After Saul's death, David became king of Israel, and for the first time, really, as much as could be said, the kingdom is united under King David. After David's death, King Solomon. You've heard the wisdom of Solomon, the great prosperity that Solomon experienced. Didn't spread, well, there was some, because of their prosperity, other kingdoms came to them for advice and wanted to do business, but it wasn't as though the nature and the revelation of God got spread very far. But as the kingdom of Solomon grew greater, so did the expense of maintaining it, so it included heavy taxation. Solomon dies, Rehoboam, his son, becomes king. His advisors tell him, you should lower the taxes so that the people will be happier with you, accept you. And instead of listening to his advisors, he goes to his drinking buddies and they say, no, tax them heavier. You're the king. They got to serve you. Well, he decided to tax them heavier, and the kingdom split. Northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. The southern kingdom included the city of Jerusalem and the temple. The northern kingdom decided, well, we can do this on our own, and they decided to do their own imitation of the Jewish ceremonies, and it wasn't very long until it turned into pagan worship. God, through his judgment, and really the kingdom of Judah even followed after pagan rituals and neighboring religions. And so God decided he was going to judge both for not worshiping properly, not serving properly. And then he used kingdoms like Assyria. In 721 BC, Assyria came and destroyed the northern kingdom. Those Jews left, some of them exiled to Judah, some of them were dispersed throughout the kingdom of Assyria. And then he used Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, to destroy Judah. And then we saw this, the first capture of Judah was the exile, or the deportation of the 50 to 75 young men, of which Daniel was one. There were two more deportations, I think 597 BC, the second deportation of people. And then finally the last one is 587. King Zedekiah, who Nebuchadnezzar had put in charge of Judah as a puppet leader, decided to rebel, and Nebuchadnezzar came and leveled the city, destroyed the temple and everything. The prophet Jeremiah during that time warned all the Israelites that your paganism, your idolatry is going to cause God's wrath. But he told them as well that this exile would only last 70 years. There's an end. And the neat thing about this whole exile is God accomplished two things in this. And he used evil pagan cultures to do it. The first one is that he used those cultures to discipline and chastise the Jewish people for their pagan worship. The second one is that he spread the knowledge of his goodness, the knowledge of his sovereignty, to two very large kingdoms. Right? We saw in Nebuchadnezzar, when he turned his eyes to heaven, then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" Nebuchadnezzar recognizes God as sovereign over everything. And then Darius at the end of chapter 6, for he is a living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and the earth. And God used what started out as four teenagers that would not compromise their faith in God, would not compromise their witness. They modeled their submission to God's sovereignty, modeled what it meant to serve the one true God, submitting to his sovereignty. And that really is the issue, isn't it? All of us. The issue for all of us is submitting to God's sovereignty in our lives. I truly believe that the reason a lot of people don't want to believe in God is because if there is a God, he's in control and they're not. We all want to be the captain of our own ship, right? The general of our own army, the driver of our own car. We want to say that we're in charge. We have this free will. We're able to do as we please, when we please, and how we please. There's a God. Somebody else is in charge. I think it's a lifelong struggle to stay submitted to the sovereignty of God. Paul wrote to the Romans, chapter 12, verse 1, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in the view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." Well, you know the problem of a living sacrifice? It always crawls off the altar. Let's carry this idea of God's sovereignty just a little bit further. If God is in control of everything, does that mean God is in control of everything? Right? The dust motes floating in the air. Charles Spurgeon had said, yeah, he even controls those dust motes. And they're there, folks. You're breathing them in. Right now, you're breathing in dust motes, and God is in control of that. He is in control of every little subatomic particle, which means he's in control of all the bad things that happen as well. And that idea will tear you up, right? He's in control of the World Trade Center bombings, the tsunamis, the wars. But to handle that, you have to look at what the greatest sin ever created, ever enacted, actually, was a sacrifice, a crucifixion of Christ upon the cross. Peter wrote in Acts, this man, he's referring to Jesus, was handed over by God's set purpose and foreknowledge to you. He's talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And with the help of wicked men to put him to death by nailing him on the cross. Peter's saying here, this was God's plan all along, to put Christ upon the cross. The greatest sin of mankind ever. God planned that. Isaiah 53 says it's the Father bruising the Son. And the message, of course, is we find in John 3:16. The reason he committed this, and the reason all these things happen, is for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. It is God's love that we can grasp onto when we don't understand what's going on in the world, the terrible things that are going on in the world, knowing that he has control of it all. You think about that.